Aloha and welcome to this fourth part of the Digits Meteor application development experience. And now we're going to really get into some heavy stuff. Well, it's not that heavy. I mean, it's not quite as trivial as the other ones. You're going to have to think a little bit harder, but the good news is that this, I think, this form processing is a really good way for you to get your get a handle on the way information flows in a Meteor application and the use of helper functions and events. And once you kind of feel comfortable with helper functions and events, then you're kind of off to the races with Meteor, at least at the kind of to the intermediate stage. And you can get quite a lot done. In fact, just understanding events and helpers, that's going to be plenty to get you to the end of this course and to build interesting applications. But right now, I get it. They're a little mysterious, maybe a little bit incomprehensible. But I'm hoping that as you work through this practice wad and the one that comes next, you'll start to feel better about what these things do. So let's get started. Oh, the other thing I wanted to note, I've got this in here, is that whenever you're switching branches, and you're probably switching branches a fair amount, hopefully, if you're repeating these wads, one of the things that can really mess you up is if you've just got Meteor running in the background, which is, of course, like what we tend to do here, and you switch branches back and forth to systems at various states of development, it's just going to mess up Meteor. It'll mess up any application. I mean, it's not like Meteor is bad or anything, but you're kind of pulling the rug out from underneath a running process, and so that's never a good thing. So basically, when you're switching branches, I just want to kind of remind you should quit Meteor. I think it's good hygiene purposes just to do a Meteor reset so that the database gets reinitialized to nothing, and then reinvoke Meteor. In our case, that's you use that command when you're using Meteor application template. Other applications you might invoke them in a different way. But anyway, when you're switching branches back and forth, do this, and then Meteor won't act weird simply because you switched branches. The worst part of it is, you spend an hour trying to debug your application that's not running right, and then you finally realize it was just because you forgot to reset Meteor when you switched a branch. So that's just a little bit you got to learn. Okay, so what we're going to do is start the timer, and we're going to create and switch to a branch called add contact 1. So let's go into GitHub. We're in our master branch of digits, and so we'll call this add contact 1. Create branch. Okay, and we're going to update. So we're going to start. There's 2 pages. We're only going to work on 2 pages for this. First is we're going to work on the add contact page.html, but we're going to use Meteor example form as our example. We're not going to use the Meteor application template as the example because that uses autoform to basically abstract away all the interesting parts about form processing. So we need to use Meteor example form, and in fact there's a page there that has everything we need to know called create student data page. And so let's start by using that page as a way to update, make our add contact page, take it from the mock-up mode that we had it in when we initially built it to a mode where it can actually function to add contacts. Okay. So let's just go ahead and do that. So here we are in Meteor example form, and this is the create student data page. And it's, it might look intimidating, but it's not really. The first thing to note is that in digits, if we go to our add contact page, we notice that all we're dealing with is text fields. We're not dealing with radio buttons or checkboxes or multiple selections and so forth. So actually things so the only thing we have to really focus on from our Meteor example form is this very first field, which is the text field. Okay, and so that's good news. And then the other thing I want to point out is actually we have to also focus on this first line here in order to get validation. So let's start with that. We want to have our form class contents look like that. So we're going to do, or close to that. So we'll do that, and then we'll switch back to digits. And here's our form here. Instead of just this very simple UI form, which was sufficient for the mock-up, now we're going to have a UI form, and we'll call this contact data form. And then we have these two helper functions, success class and error class. And remember, you got to kind of remember how this worked in the case of Meteor example form, is that when the submission was successful, we had a little message that appeared at the bottom that was indicating success. In the case of an error, we had little error fields appearing throughout the form. Now it turns out that for this digits example, we don't need a success class because we're not going to display anything at the bottom of this page when it's successful. In fact, according to the instructions, what we're supposed to do now is redirect to the home page upon successful form submission, which is actually a little bit more plausible. Normally when you fill out a form and you press submit, it takes you someplace else. It doesn't just leave you on that page where you don't really normally want to be anymore. So in the case of Meteor, in the case of the digits application, once we submit a form, we're going to go back to the home page, and then that home page has a list of all the contacts, and our new contact should actually appear on that page. All that's to say we don't need this success class anymore because we're not going to be showing anything on this add form page to indicate success. We will need the error class handler function because we want to display errors. Okay, so that's that. And then that's why I'm not going to do the error class. Whoops, I'm sorry, in the wrong place. And so now if we go back to Meteor example form, we want to look carefully at this particular input field to make sure that everything that we include in Meteor example form we've got in digits. And so we need the type text name equals name, ID equals name, placeholder equals name. Okay, so if we go back to digits, what we notice, we've got type text name equals first, placeholder is first name, but we don't have an ID equals first. So let's just add that in for so that we're covering our bases here. So I'm going to add it to back, because all of these things are text fields. Basically everything I do for one, I do for all of them. Okay, so there's our 5, and now IntelliJ is great. It knows enough about HTML to say, you should never have duplicate IDs on a page, and I agree with IntelliJ wholeheartedly. So let's just make the name and the ID fields exactly the same, because that's what we were doing in Meteor example form. Okay, so there's that, and then if we go back to Meteor example form, the next thing we need to worry about is displaying error messages when validation fails. And this is the way it looks, and it looks this way basically in all the cases where you've got these worms. You have this if statement, and then you're going to display this little error message box with some appropriate error message when this helper function returns true, which is the display name field error. If you look down below, there's like a display GPA field error and so forth. So what we'll do is we'll create a copy of this. We'll go back to digits, and we'll say, where should we display? Let's display it right underneath the input. So we'll say if display first field error, then you must specify your first name. And then underneath this input, we'll say if display last field error, you must specify your last name. And then under address, because these are all required fields, they're going to be, if they're empty, we're going to get a error. And then underneath telephone, if display telephone, there's actually kind of a cute way to refactor this so we don't have to do all these different helper functions. But but I'll leave that as something. I'll leave that to you to kind of figure out. And for right now, we're just going to do it the most straightforward way. Okay, so we got all those error messages, which is good. And then the last thing I'm kind of worried about is this button UI button type equals submit button. Let's just check to make sure that's the same. So we go down here, we see UI primary, that's submit Okay, so it's just the same. I mean, it has this primary class, but that's just a formatting thing to make the button pop out a little bit more. And we're not going to have the success message because we're actually going to redirect or go to a different page if everything's successful. Okay, so that seems like we're pretty good and on the HTML. All right, so now let's look at our JavaScript. Well, if we go back to, let's just check in here. So we updated our add contact page.html using create student data page as the template. Hopefully it's okay. We'll, of course we'll find out when we test this out. Now let's move on to add contact page.js, and we're going to use the create student data page.js as our template. So add contact page.js is completely empty in our application. So I think the fastest and easiest thing to do here is we'll just do a propeller A to select the whole thing, propeller C to copy it, and then we're just going to copy that whole bit of text, bam, right into our add contact page.js in digits. Now we got to go through and edit it to make it work right. And so just kind of starting at the top, we know that we're not going to be using student data. We're going to be using contacts data. Or we're going to be using, contacts. That's the collection. And then contact schema is the schema from API contacts.js. And if you just go up to API contacts, we're going to export contacts, and we export contact schema. So that's what we're importing. And then IntelliJ says we're not using that yet, which is fine. We just put it in there. Okay. We know that we're not going to display success messages, right? Because we're going to do a flow router go to the home page. So we'll just get rid of that line. But we will display error messages, so we're going to need that. The next thing you got to be really careful about is to update these template, on created so forth to reflect the template that we're actually in now. The template that we're dealing with is add contact or add contact page. So let's make sure our helper functions say see, add contact page. All right. So we're in add contact page.js. This should say add contact page. In fact, let's just, so that we don't have a crazy error later on, let's update all of these guys right now so that while we're thinking about it. Okay. Okay, so we fixed that. That's a definite source of potential bugs. And we know success messages are not going to be displayed, so we get rid of that. Remember, we're creating this reactive dictionary that will be updated. Always kind of hold the current state of this page with respect to whether or not we should be displaying error messages or not. And we want to initialize it on create to say don't display any error messages. And then we're going to say contacts schema, because that's what we just imported up here. Name contacts, and then we should just say, we should call this add contact page. This could be any unique string here, but by naming it the same as the page, the template that we're associating it with, it just makes more sense. It's guaranteed to be unique because templates are guaranteed to be unique, and it's easy to kind of track down where things are. Okay, so as I said before, we don't need the success class helper anymore because we're not displaying. We're not checking on success in order to display something. Similarly, we're never going to display a success message, so we don't need that helper function. But we do need this helper function. And this helper function says we're going to return the value of, if the value of the message flag's reactive dictionary, when we get the key to display error messages, when that's true, we'll return the string error. So that basically says, just to kind of remind you, that up here in our form, the way semantic UI works is if it sees the string, if the error class, if a class name error is in this UI form class specification up here, it's going to display any error fields or any error messages that exist in the form. So basically, when we call this handler function error class, which is defined here, what we're basically going to do is either we're going to return the empty string, so of course semantic UI will do nothing, or we're going to return the string error, which is going to be inserted into this class, which means semantic UI now is going to want to display all the error fields. And you can look at the semantic UI form documentation to kind of sort that out. But that's what that handler function does. Okay, now we've got all these other handler functions, or helper functions I should say, which are used to figure out whether or not we want to insert into the HTML these little error message divs. Okay, because the way that semantic UI works is if it sees the class error up here, any of these little error message divs that exist in the HTML are going to be displayed. So we only want to insert those into the HTML when in fact the associated field actually has an error. Okay, so we've got first, last, address, telephone, and email. So what I'm going to say here is display first, and then we want to check to see if the key is first, and then there's a last, check to see if the key is last, and then we have address, check to see if it's address, and then we need a couple more. And I just want to comment, you notice that these functions look almost exactly the same except for what they're checking. And so it is possible to define this helper function, take an argument which is passed in from the HTML that indicates which key it should be looking at. I'm just not going to do it because I'm worried that will make at least things too complicated for some of you while you're learning how to do this. Obviously, once you kind of get your sea legs with Meteor, you'll be going, oh, look at all that repeated code. That is absolutely nuts. I'm never going to do that. That's poor software engineering, which it is. But hopefully, it's going to help you, at least now, to kind of keep straight how things work. Okay, so those are all our helper functions. Now we turn to, let me just check to see, is there any other helper functions? I don't think so. Display error, display telephone, display email. Looks like we got them all. Now we turn to this onRendered function, which in the case of the Meteor example form is there in order to load some JavaScript through jQuery for the checkbox, radio box, and selections. Okay, it turns out that we're not using any of those things. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to comment that out because maybe we're going to update this form later and add in a selection to something, and then we'll want to add this back in. So I think a reasonable strategy here is to say I may need to expand this page in future, and I'm going to keep this code around to remind myself that I'm going to need to do that if I need it. Okay, so now we say, here we are on the Add Contact page event handler. So the first thing is we need to track down what event has been fired, and the simple way to do that is by saying, here is the submit that is associated with this form that has this contact data form in there. So we should be able to say submit.contactDataForm, and we'll get the event and the template associated with it. Now this looks very complicated, but the thing to note is that only the first field in Meteor example form is actually a test field. Everything else are like text areas and checkboxes and radio buttons and so forth. So what you get to do is simply delete all this stuff for these kind of fields that you don't really care about. I'm even going to delete that comment. And I'm going to say const name first equals event.target.first.value. And then I'm going to duplicate that 4 more times and say last is last. And then I'm going to say address equals address. And then I'm going to say telephone equals telephone, and this is the way I'm going to get the values out of that form. Okay? Now you may be saying to yourself, I hope you're saying to yourself at this point, my goodness, there's a lot of code. There is a bunch of code that looks almost exactly the same except for, you know, these characters in here. I wonder if there's a way to abstract out and get this stuff without so much code duplication, and indeed in JavaScript there is, absolutely. I'm not going to show you it because this is a little more straightforward to read for a beginner. But you know, as your forms get bigger and so forth, you might want to think about writing a little helper function or something or maybe using underscore with some kind of list that enables you to get at this stuff more easily. But we won't do that right now because I just think, I don't know. I don't want to get so clever on you guys that you're lost. I mean, it's easy enough to be lost as it is. Okay, so now we have, we've gotten all these values out of the event, which was fired when somebody hit the submit button. So now we know what they've actually submitted for these things. We've constructed an object containing these things, okay, which we can now send to contact schema, new contact, Okay, so now let's do a few more of these. Okay, so we've got our object. We reset validation, so we're trying from scratch to see whether this is okay. And then we invoke the clean method on new contact. That's to ensure that when we actually try to submit via insert this new data, since doing insertion does a clean, we want to do our clean ourselves so that the validation in this event handler works exactly the same way that the validation will work when we're actually running insert. That's why we do that. Okay, and we put new contact here, and then we'll say contacts.insert. Now, so what we've just done is we've created a new contact. We've gotten rid of any old error messages. Oh, shoots. Gotten rid of any old error messages. We've cleaned that object so that it's going to be validated the same way it will be validated when we do the insert. We invoke the validation on it. If the validation was okay, everything's fine with it, we'll go into this is valid part of it. So what we'll do is we'll call contacts.insert new contact. We don't need to display a success message because we're not doing that. But we do want to set our error messages to be false. And then, finally, we want to invoke flowrouter.go homepage. Okay, because remember that was the whole big deal, is we wanted to go back to and display the home page when we had a successful insertion. So it's saying, I don't know about flowrouter, so where is flowrouter defined? Let's go look around here, and I think there it is. Okay, so here's a use of the import statement for flowrouter. It's one of the more, one of the more kind of, I don't know, a little bit irritating parts of Meteor is figuring out what the darn import statements look like, because, you know, how are you going to remember that? I guess you could remember it, but I can't. Okay, so now we're getting a message, ID is defined but never used. That's because we used to need that in that success message. We don't anymore, so we can just simply call insert and throw away the new ID. Okay, so that looks good. However, we don't worry about display message. Otherwise, we're going to set the display error messages to be true, which means we're going to show this validation stuff. And then let's see what this guy, oh, he doesn't want that empty space there. And looks like we're okay. Now, I'm going to show you a little thing that I like to do when I'm first putting together some form submission. And that is, I'm going to do console.log new contact right here. And then I'm going to do console.log success. And this is just a bootstrapping thing for the first time that I run this code. I just want to see that things are happening the way I want them to happen. Okay, so I've got so that finishes off the JavaScript. We've got the HTML. So I think what we can do now, we look here. It's building the application. Okay, and so if we go to digits and we go to add contact, let's just try hitting submit without anything in there and see what happens. Okay, and what happens is like what we want. Okay, we get all these validation messages, and furthermore, if we go do a propeller J, we can see that we have an object with like nothing in it. Okay, which makes sense because we didn't put anything in there. So let's say, well, actually, who do I want to say? Let's say Cam Moore, address, University of Hawaii, and then telephone 808-999-1234, email cmoore@hawaii.edu. So having fixed all that, let's try to submit. And look at that. We went to back to the home page. Cam is in there. And now we can see that our object that we created, our new contact, looks just perfect. And this is successful. Now just for grins, what happens if only one field is bad? So we'll say foo bar address Bazola, telephone 999-1234, but the email's bad. Let's just try that, submit. That's great. We see that only the email is wrong, so we could say baz@bar.com, submit, everything's good. All right, so let's go back and see where we are. So we've tested. Let's commit our changes to GitHub. We've only worked on 2 pages this whole time. So add contact page now working. And we commit our branch. I think we're supposed to check to see that it's there. So we can go there and we can see we pushed a branch, so that looks good. And stop the timer. We'll call that 25 minutes. Took a little bit of time, but I think there was a lot of explanation, hopefully a review of what, how this stuff works. So I think probably you could get it done in 20 minutes if you weren't jabbering to somebody the whole time you were trying to work. But we'll call it 25 minutes for RX.